There is a particular kind of darkness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with sirens or explosions. It comes quietly, dressed in a suit, carrying a briefcase, speaking in measured sentences about national interest and strategic necessity. It arrives in the form of a man who could explain, with complete calm, why certain suffering was simply the cost of stability. Henry Kissinger was that kind of darkness, and he was also, depending on who you ask, a kind of genius. That tension is exactly what makes him worth examining slowly, carefully, in the quiet hours when the noise of the day has finally settled. Because Kissinger isn't a simple story. He isn't a villain from central casting or a hero from a textbook. He is something more uncomfortable than either. He is a man who made consequential choices that shaped millions of lives and who believed with absolute conviction that he was doing what had to be done. So before we go further, take a breath, get comfortable, because the story of Henry Kissinger requires patience. It requires holding two things at once: the strategic brilliance and the body count, the diplomatic architecture and the human wreckage beneath it. The central question this story asks is a simple one. How does a single advisor, a man with no army, no election, no mandate from the public, come to sit at the center of so many of the 20th century's most consequential and most catastrophic decisions? How does one person's worldview ripple outward until it touches the jungles of Southeast Asia, the mountains of South America, the corridors of Beijing, and the deserts of the Middle East, all at the same time? To understand any of that, you need to understand one word: realpolitik. Realpolitik is a German term, and it means something roughly like politics grounded in reality rather than ideals. It is the governing philosophy that says nations do not have friends, they have interests. That morality is a luxury that great powers cannot always afford. That the goal of statecraft is not to be good but to be effective. That stability, even an ugly stability maintained through force or compromise with terrible regimes, is preferable to the chaos that idealism so often produces. Kissinger did not invent this idea. It stretches back centuries to figures like Metternich and Bismarck, European statesmen who Kissinger studied with something close to reverence. But he became, in the second half of the 20th century, its most powerful practitioner. He turned it from a philosophy into a foreign policy. And in doing so, he changed the world in ways that are still unfolding today. The theaters of his influence are staggering in their breadth. There is Vietnam, where Kissinger helped negotiate a peace that cost tens of thousands of additional lives before it was signed. There is Cambodia, where decisions made in secret resulted in one of the most devastating bombing campaigns in modern history. There is Laos, where a shadow war was conducted for years while the American public was told almost nothing about it. There is Chile, where a democratically elected government was undermined and a dictatorship was, at minimum, encouraged. There is Bangladesh, where hundreds of thousands of people died while American policy looked the other way. There is China, where Kissinger orchestrated one of the most audacious diplomatic openings of the Cold War. There is the Soviet Union, where he shaped an era of negotiated tension called Détente. There is the Middle East, where he personally shuttled between capitals trying to prevent another catastrophic war. In each of these places, Kissinger made choices, and in each of these places, people died. The relationship between those two facts is what we are here to examine. This is not a prosecution, it is not a defense either. It is an honest reckoning with a man who accumulated more power than almost any diplomat in American history, and who wielded that power according to principles that most of the world never voted for and was never asked to approve. Because that is the thing about realpolitik, it tends to happen in private. It tends to produce classified cables and back-channel conversations and plausible deniability. The people it affects most severely are rarely in the room when the decisions are made. So tonight, we trace the arc of Henry Kissinger's life from its quiet and unlikely beginning through the corridors of power where history was being made in real time and into the long, complicated aftermath of what he left behind. Start here. Start with a boy, a war, and a world that was about to change forever. Heinz Alfred Kissinger was born in 1923 in Fürth, a small city in Bavaria, Germany. He grew up in a Jewish family in a country that was beginning to come apart at the seams. His father was a school teacher, his mother managed the household. By most accounts, It was an ordinary, modest, quietly dignified life. And then it wasn't. The Weimar Republic, the fragile democratic government that had held Germany together since the end of the First World War, was collapsing under the weight of economic catastrophe, political violence, and the rising pressure of a movement that had no interest in fragility or democracy. When Kissinger was 10 years old, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. By the time he was 11, Jewish children were being expelled from public schools. His father lost his teaching position. The family was pushed steadily to the margins of the society they had considered their own. What Kissinger absorbed during those years was not a lesson in idealism. It was a lesson in what happens when order fails, when institutions that seem permanent turn out to be paper-thin, when the social contract collapses and what remains is raw power arranged against the vulnerable. His family escaped in 1938, the year of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass when Jewish businesses and synagogues were burned across Germany while police watched. They came to New York. Heinz became Henry. He worked in a shaving brush factory in the Bronx. He attended evening classes. He was, by any measure, a refugee, a person whose previous world had been taken from him by force, who now had to build something new in a country that didn't quite fit yet. Then came the war. Kissinger was drafted into the United States Army and sent back to Europe. He served in military intelligence in Germany, helping to identify and neutralize former Gestapo officers after liberation. He was 20 years old, walking through the ruins of the country that had expelled him, now carrying the authority of a conquering army. It would be difficult to overstate how that experience shaped his understanding of what power actually is, what it can do, and what happens in its absence. After the war, he went to Harvard on the GI Bill, and Harvard is where Henry Kissinger became the thinker who would eventually become the strategist. He was brilliant, relentlessly so, and he found his intellectual home in the history of European diplomacy. His undergraduate thesis ran nearly 400 pages. His doctoral dissertation examined the Congress of Vienna and the great powers who rebuilt European stability after the Napoleonic Wars. The figures he returned to again and again were Metternich and Castlereagh, statesmen who had accepted an imperfect peace because they understood that the alternative was continued catastrophe. There is a direct line between the boy who watched Weimar Germany disintegrate and the scholar who spent years studying how civilizations hold themselves together. Both were asking the same question: how do you preserve order in a world that is always threatening to come apart? His early academic work on nuclear strategy brought him wider attention. His 157 book, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, argued that the United States needed a more flexible approach to nuclear deterrence, one that could respond to smaller provocations without triggering total war. It was a controversial argument, and it made him a name in the circles where foreign policy was actually debated. By the early 1960s, Kissinger was consulting for the Kennedy administration, circling the edges of real power. His worldview was already fully formed. History was not a story of moral progress. It was a story of competing forces that had to be managed, balanced, and occasionally sacrificed against each other. Idealism was a pleasant story that weaker nations could afford to tell themselves. Great powers did not have that luxury. He believed every word of it. By the time Kissinger arrived at Harvard as a serious intellectual force, he had already built the architecture of a worldview that would guide every decision he ever made. It did not come from optimism. It did not come from faith in democratic institutions or the slow march of human progress. It came from a man who had watched order collapse firsthand, who had studied the rubble left behind when great powers stopped managing their competition and started pursuing their ideals instead. The word he kept coming back to was realpolitik. It is a German word, which is perhaps appropriate. It means, roughly, politics based on practical considerations rather than moral or ideological ones. A state does not pursue justice. A state pursues interests. A state does not ask what is right. It asks what is necessary. Kissinger believed this was not cynicism. He believed it was clarity. The alternative in his reading of history was not a more moral world. It was a more chaotic one. His intellectual heroes were two men from the 19th century. Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian statesman who had managed the European balance of power for decades after Napoleon, and Robert Stuart, Viscount Castlereagh, the British Foreign Secretary who helped construct the framework at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. What these men had done, in Kissinger's view, was something genuinely remarkable. They had taken a continent exhausted by revolutionary war and built a structure of competing powers that kept the peace, not by making everyone agree, not by installing a single dominant ideology, but by making sure no single state could dominate everyone else. It was not a perfect peace. It was not a just peace by any modern standard. Smaller nations were traded, partitioned, and managed by the great powers with little regard for the populations involved. But Europe did not have another general war for nearly 100 years. To Kissinger, that was the point. Stability was its own moral achievement. A world that did not have catastrophic war was preferable to a world that tried to be morally pure and burned everything down in the attempt. This put him in direct opposition to a tradition that had dominated American foreign policy thinking for most of the 20th century. Liberal internationalism, the idea that the United States had a special obligation to spread democracy, human rights, and open institutions around the world, was not just naive in Kissinger's view. It was dangerous. Presidents from Woodrow Wilson forward had framed American foreign policy in the language of universal values, of making the world safe for democracy, of standing up for freedom everywhere. Kissinger thought this was a story Americans told themselves to feel good about wielding enormous power. The problem, as he saw it, was that moral rhetoric did not actually govern decisions. Behind the speeches about freedom and democracy, the United States had always acted in its interests. The moral language just made it harder to see clearly, and when leaders started believing their own rhetoric, when they convinced themselves that their foreign policy was actually a crusade rather than a competition, that is when they made the worst mistakes. Vietnam, in Kissinger's view, was partly a product of that kind of ideological overreach. What he proposed instead was something colder and more honest, at least in his own framing. Great powers should pursue a stable balance. They should manage their rivalries through controlled channels, through back-channel negotiations conducted by small numbers of trusted officials with the authority to make real commitments. Public diplomacy, he believed, was largely theater. The actual work of international order happened quietly, between elites who understood the rules of the game, who were not bound by domestic opinion or moral grandstanding, who could acknowledge the hard trade-offs that public audiences were not prepared to accept. Secrecy, for Kissinger, was not a corruption of diplomacy. It was a precondition for it. If every negotiation had to survive public scrutiny in real time, no serious negotiation could happen. Concessions that were strategically necessary would be denounced as betrayals. Compromises that served long-term stability would be attacked as weakness. The public, in his view, wanted reassurance, not complexity. The statesman's job was to manage complexity on their behalf, even if that meant managing it out of their sight. Controlled escalation was another tool in this framework. The idea that military pressure, carefully calibrated and credibly threatened, could move adversaries toward the negotiating table without triggering a wider war. This was not recklessness. It required precision, an understanding of how much pressure an adversary could absorb before a crisis became a catastrophe. Kissinger had studied this problem in his work on nuclear strategy, and he brought the same logic to conventional conflicts. You did not have to win outright. You had to convince the other side that the cost of continuing exceeded the cost of settling. The criticism of this entire framework, and it came early and it never stopped, was that it treated the world as though it were made entirely of great powers and their interests, with smaller nations functioning as pieces on a board, rather than societies of actual human beings. When Metternich and Castlereagh traded populations at Vienna, those populations had no voice in the arrangement. When Kissinger's framework required that smaller countries be pressured, destabilized, or simply ignored, the people living in those countries bore the consequences of decisions made in rooms they would never enter by men who would never know their names. Kissinger had an answer to this, and he gave it often. Sentiment was not a substitute for strategy. A foreign policy driven by compassion for every suffering population in every corner of the world was not a foreign policy. It was an emotion. And an emotion, no matter how genuine, could not manage the relationship between nuclear-armed superpowers or prevent the kind of systemic collapse that killed millions. The statesman who refused to accept hard trade-offs was not more moral than the one who accepted them. He was just more comfortable. His critics said that was a convenient argument for a man who was never the one paying the price of those trade-offs, that the populations written off as expendable in the interest of stability had a different view of what was being traded away, that there was something troubling about a framework in which the suffering of smaller nations was always the acceptable cost and never the unacceptable limit. Both sides of this argument were fully formed before Kissinger ever entered government. He had written most of it out already, in his doctoral dissertation, in his early books, in the academic papers that circulated through foreign policy seminars. The theory was complete. What remained was the application. And that application was about to arrive, because Richard Nixon had just won the presidency, and he was looking for someone who thought about power the way he did. Someone who understood that the real work happened in the shadows. Someone who believed, as Nixon believed, that the world was too dangerous to be managed by people who were too principled to do what was necessary. Kissinger was ready. He had been ready for years. Richard Nixon did not trust easily. He did not trust institutions, he did not trust elites, and he especially did not trust people who seemed to be universally admired. He saw them as potential enemies, but he did trust a certain kind of mind. Suspicious, calculating, obsessed with leverage. He trusted people who believed, as he did, that the world was hostile and that power had to be grasped firmly or it would be taken away. Henry Kissinger, despite being a Harvard professor, despite moving comfortably in the very establishment Nixon hated, had that kind of mind. Their connection began indirectly. During the 1968 campaign, Kissinger was still advising the Johnson administration on Vietnam peace talks. At the same time, he quietly passed inside information about those talks to the Nixon campaign. He delivered gossip and technical details about the Paris negotiations, updates on North Vietnamese behavior, assessments of Johnson's strategy. It was not yet a formal alliance, but it was a signal. Kissinger could live in two worlds at once. He could be inside the system and useful to the men trying to rearrange it. When Nixon won, he needed a national security advisor. Traditionally, that job was important but not dominant. The State Department ran foreign policy. The Secretary of State spoke to allies, negotiated treaties, represented the United States abroad. The National Security Advisor coordinated, synthesized, and handed options to the president. Nixon did not want a coordinator. He wanted a gatekeeper. He also did not want the usual candidates. He distrusted the Eastern establishment, the striped pants diplomats of the State Department, the bipartisan foreign policy consensus that had long excluded him. He had spent his career feeling looked down on by them. The idea of turning foreign policy back over to that world was intolerable. Kissinger arrived as a kind of paradox. He was Harvard and Council on Foreign Relations, the very definition of establishment respectability, but he was also Jewish, a refugee, and not tied to the Republican old guard. He had criticized liberal internationalism, questioned Vietnam's strategy, and written admiringly about leaders who held immense power in their own hands. He was enough of an outsider to satisfy Nixon's resentment, and enough of an insider to impress him. Nixon interviewed several candidates. Kissinger's advantage was simple. He spoke about the world the same way Nixon did, only more elegantly. Great powers, spheres of influence, leverage over adversaries and allies. The need for secrecy, for control, for linkage between issues so that nothing was given away without getting something in return. Nixon heard his own instincts turned into doctrine. So Kissinger was appointed National Security Advisor in January 1969. He did not come in as a humble staff officer. He came in with an agenda, and a president willing to reshape the machinery of government around that agenda. The first move was centralization. Nixon and Kissinger believed that foreign policy had been too fragmented. Too many agencies, too many ambassadors freelancing, too many congressional committees demanding briefings and leaking whatever they heard. They saw this not as healthy democracy but as chaos. Loose talk in Washington became speculation in foreign capitals. Leaked memos became front-page stories in the New York Times. In their minds, this weakened the United States, so they pulled decision-making into the White House. The National Security Council system was redesigned. Papers flowed through Kissinger's office. Options were framed there. Access to the president on foreign policy went through him. The State Department would still write cables and draft talking points. But the real decisions, what offers to make, what threats to convey, which crises to escalate, and which to cool, would be shaped in the West Wing. Their suspicion had three main targets: the State Department, which they saw as too cautious, too committed to its own routines, and too willing to prioritize relationships with foreign governments over the president's political needs. Congress, which they regarded as meddling, parochial, and fundamentally incapable of keeping secrets. Brief Congress, they believed, and within days every detail would be on television, turning diplomacy into performance. And the press, which Nixon saw as his personal enemy. Journalists, in his view, were eager to undermine him, eager to turn every compromise into a scandal, every pause in bombing into weakness, every private assurance into a betrayal of American principles. In that atmosphere, secrecy was not just a preference. It was a governing method. Kissinger began building back channels, private lines to Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, quiet intermediaries to Beijing, direct conduits to foreign leaders that bypassed their own foreign ministries and his own bureaucracies. Messages were carried not through formal cables but through personal emissaries, handwritten notes, or meetings recorded in Kissinger's own files rather than the State Department's archives. Each back channel did two things at once. It served Nixon's desire for control and deniability, and it increased Kissinger's personal power. If the only person who knew exactly what had been promised in a secret meeting with Moscow was Henry Kissinger, then every subsequent step, every follow-up, every adjustment had to go through him. If Paris peace talks with North Vietnam were supplemented or undercut by entirely separate negotiations conducted by Kissinger in another hotel room, then the formal negotiators became secondary. The real map of American commitments existed in Kissinger's head and in his private notes, not in the official record. Foreign leaders learned quickly. To reach the president, you reached Kissinger. To understand American policy, you listened to what he hinted at, not necessarily what the ambassador said in public. Ambassadors began to realize they were often the last to know what Washington had already decided. Inside this arrangement was a peculiar relationship between the two men at the center of it. Nixon and Kissinger were not friends in any normal sense. Nixon was wary, brooding, prone to late-night resentment. Kissinger was ambitious, theatrical, eager for approval from the same elites Nixon despised. Each needed the other. Each resented the other for being needed. Nixon held the ultimate power. Without the presidency, Kissinger was a professor again. Nixon could elevate him, sideline him, or replace him. He could take credit for Kissinger's successes and make him the face of unpopular decisions. Kissinger, in turn, held something Nixon craved: intellectual validation and execution. He could translate Nixon's instincts into coherent strategies, manage the complex webs of communication required to make them real, and absorb much of the public criticism that might otherwise land directly on the president. When things went well, Nixon could say that his vision had guided it. When things went badly, Kissinger could be blamed for the details. The rivalry surfaced in small ways. Nixon complained that Kissinger took too much public credit, cultivated reporters, accepted flattering profiles. Kissinger complained privately that Nixon's insecurity made everything harder, that important moves were delayed or distorted by the president's sense of grievance. But underneath the tension was dependence. Nixon needed someone who believed in secrecy and balance of power as deeply as he did. Kissinger needed a president willing to concentrate authority in his hands. Together, they built a foreign policy system in which moral questions were pushed to the margins, and the management of power was placed firmly at the center. That system would soon be tested in the place where American power had already been bleeding for years: Vietnam. When Nixon and Kissinger took office in January 1969, the war in Vietnam was already a disaster on a schedule. More than 500,000 American troops were deployed. Tens of thousands were dead. The Tet Offensive had shattered public belief that victory was near. Lyndon Johnson had opened peace talks in Paris but stepped aside rather than run for re-election, with the war hanging around his neck. The new team did not start the fire. They inherited it. But they chose how to feed it, how to disguise it, and how to use it. Their room for maneuver was narrow at home. The anti-war movement was growing. Protests, draft resistance, campus occupations. Nixon had campaigned on having a secret plan for peace. But what he really had was a political problem. He needed to end the war without looking like he had lost it. Abroad, North Vietnam was dug in. Its leadership believed time and casualties were on their side. They had withstood French colonial war, American bombing, coups and countercoups in Saigon. They assumed that if they kept fighting, American domestic opinion would eventually force a withdrawal on terms favorable to Hanoi. In South Vietnam, the government of Nguyen Van Thieu was weak, factional, and dependent on American money and firepower. Saigon's army fought, but often poorly, with high desertion rates and limited legitimacy in the countryside. Everyone knew that if you simply pulled out the American plug, the lights in Saigon would go off. So Nixon and Kissinger faced three constraints at once: a weary American public, a determined enemy, and an unreliable ally. Their answer was something they called Vietnamization. On the surface, it sounded straightforward: gradually withdraw American combat troops. Train and equip the South Vietnamese army to take over the fighting. Shift the visible burden of the war from American soldiers to Vietnamese soldiers. At home, this could be sold as de-escalation, as bringing boys back from the jungle. In Saigon, it could be presented as empowerment, as standing on their own feet. To the north, it was meant to signal that America was not collapsing in panic, but reorganizing for a long haul. In practice, Vietnamization had a double edge. It did reduce American casualties over time. Fewer American families received telegrams. Television showed fewer images of U.S. soldiers dying in rice paddies. But to make Vietnamization work, the administration increased the intensity of other forms of violence. More air power, more artillery, more reliance on bombing to substitute for infantry. The war was not ending, it was changing shape. For Kissinger, this was not only about managing the battlefield. It was about creating leverage at the negotiating table. He saw the Paris peace talks as a chessboard where pressure and promises had to be calibrated. He believed that North Vietnam would not seriously compromise unless it felt pain and risked losing its main objective: control over the South. So he developed a strategy built on two pillars: public diplomacy and private coercion. Publicly, the administration talked about a just peace, about withdrawals tied to mutual de-escalation, about seeking an honorable end. Nixon gave speeches promising peace with honor, suggesting that if Hanoi was reasonable, the war could end soon. Privately, Kissinger searched relentlessly for instruments of pressure. More bombing of supply routes, more raids across borders, more signals that if Hanoi refused to bend, the United States would escalate in ways that hurt. He also tried to use time as a weapon. If he could show the North Vietnamese that American casualties were going down while their own losses remained high, he hoped they would conclude that they were bleeding for diminishing returns. If he could keep Saigon afloat just long enough, he believed the other side might accept a compromise rather than risk losing everything in a final collapse. This logic led to the idea of linkage between the battlefield and the conference table. Every offensive, every bombing campaign, every lull was designed to send a message in Paris. Harsh terms would be accompanied by intensified airstrikes. Softer proposals might come after a pause in bombing. The war itself became a form of communication, written in explosives. Kissinger also sought secret channels to Hanoi, just as he did with Moscow and Beijing. He met North Vietnamese representatives in private sessions, separate from the formal plenary meetings. There, he could offer different packages, hint at future concessions, and threaten future punishment, all without the same level of public scrutiny. Inside his own theory, this made sense. Great powers, he believed, bargained seriously only when they felt both danger and opportunity. He thought Hanoi needed to be convinced that continued resistance would be too costly, and that accepting a negotiated settlement would still give them a path to influence in the South over time. But the gap between theory and reality widened as the months passed. At home, Nixon continued to promise that peace was coming. Withdrawal schedules were announced. Troop numbers slowly fell. Speeches emphasized that the end was in sight. On the ground in Vietnam, the destruction went on. Airstrikes continued. Operations expanded across borders. Villages were bombed on one day and visited by pacification teams the next. For the people living under the flight paths, rhetoric about Vietnamization did not feel like an end to anything. For American soldiers, the experience was often surreal. They were told they were fighting in a war that was winding down. They still went out on patrols, still took fire, still saw friends killed in engagements whose larger purpose was increasingly obscure. For North Vietnam, the combination of public talk about peace and continued military pressure confirmed a different belief, that Washington was trying to secure in negotiations what it could not win outright. To Hanoi's leaders, the new strategy looked less like honorable compromise and more like a rebranding of the same determination to keep South Vietnam out of their hands. The more the White House spoke of winding down the war, the more visible the contradiction became. Casualty lists shortened for Americans, but the machinery of war roared on for Vietnamese civilians on both sides of the line. And in the search for leverage, Kissinger and Nixon reached for tools that were not meant to be seen at all. Some of the most important messages to Hanoi were not sent in South Vietnam itself, but across its borders, in countries the United States was not officially at war with. That is where the logic of leverage led next, into the skies over Cambodia. Cambodia, on a map, looked like a side room to the main battlefield. A neutral kingdom, officially outside the war. A place diplomats mentioned when they wanted to sound responsible, talking about respecting borders and international law. On the ground, it was already bleeding. For years, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces had used the eastern edge of Cambodia as a sanctuary. They slipped across the border, built base areas, stockpiled weapons, and moved men along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They knew that American and South Vietnamese troops were officially not allowed to follow. To Nixon and Kissinger, those sanctuaries were both a military irritation and a political opportunity. Militarily, they were an obvious target. If you believe wars are decided by supply lines and safe havens, then allowing your enemy to rest and rearm just over an invisible line feels like self-sabotage. Kissinger saw these Cambodian bases as a pressure point. Hit them hard enough, he thought, and you might weaken Hanoi's capacity to keep the war going at current intensity. Politically, they were a way to show toughness without visibly throwing more American soldiers into the meat grinder. You could claim to be withdrawing ground troops while quietly increasing the violence raining down from the air in places without television cameras. There was only one problem, or rather, several problems at once. Cambodia was neutral. Congress had not authorized war there. The American public had not been told about any expansion. International law was, at least on paper, clear about bombing a country you were not at war with. So the solution, in the logic of realpolitik, was simple. If the law and politics won't allow it in the open, do it in secret. In March 1969, Operation Menu began. The name itself was oddly domestic. Breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, dessert, supper. Each course was a different target set inside Cambodia. The B-52s lifted off from bases in Thailand and Guam, just as they did for Vietnam, but the paperwork was altered. This was not a sloppy, accidental misreporting. It was a deliberate system. Target coordinates for Cambodian strikes were sent in separate, restricted channels. On official records, those same bomb loads were listed as falling inside South Vietnam. Radar operators were told what to enter. Logs were falsified from the beginning. Only a small circle of officers and officials knew the truth. Kissinger, sitting in Washington, personally reviewed target lists. He and Nixon discussed which sanctuaries to hit, how hard, and with what timing in relation to the Paris talks. When the orders went out, they bypassed normal chains and went to a hand-picked group, instructed to keep quiet and keep the books clean. To Congress, the administration spoke in general terms about hitting enemy infiltration routes and border areas. No one said, "We are bombing a neutral country in a way designed to leave almost no paper trail." On a map in a situation room, it could look tidy. Strike sanctuaries, destroy storage depots, kill enemy troops resting between campaigns. Signal to Hanoi that there was no safe rear area anymore. All of it was meant to increase leverage, to convince the other side that the costs of continuing the war might finally outweigh the benefits. On the ground, it was far less tidy. B-52s did not drop precise surgical munitions. They dropped carpets of explosives over large rectangles of land. A single sortie could wipe out a village, a forest, a set of rice fields, whatever happened to be under the grid squares that day. The official targets were base areas. In practice, those base areas were interwoven with Cambodian settlements, farms, and roads. Intelligence was often fragmentary, based on aerial photos, intercepted communications, or reports filtered through South Vietnamese and American officers with their own agendas. From 1969 to 1973, the United States dropped more than 2.7 million tons of bombs on Cambodia. By comparison, that is more tonnage than the Allies dropped in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. The human cost is still debated. Estimates of Cambodian civilians killed by the bombing range from the low hundreds of thousands to 500,000. Numbers on a page cannot capture what that meant in lived experience. Families obliterated at night, survivors fleeing shattered villages, communities uprooted by a war they had not chosen. The political cost inside Cambodia was just as severe. Prince Norodom Sihanouk had tried to walk a narrow path of neutrality, tolerating some North Vietnamese presence while keeping his fragile state out of direct confrontation. The bombing, combined with internal rivalries, helped break that balance. In 1970, Sihanouk was overthrown in a coup by General Lon Nol, who tilted openly toward the United States. The war moved more fully into Cambodia. North Vietnamese forces pushed deeper in. American and South Vietnamese troops mounted incursions across the border. Cambodian society, already strained, began to fracture. Into that chaos stepped the Khmer Rouge. Before the war expanded, they were a small, marginal communist movement. After years of bombing, displacement, and civil war, they found a powerful recruitment tool. They could point to craters where villages used to be and say, "This is what American imperialism looks like. This is what the corrupt government in Phnom Penh has allowed." Survivors of bombed areas were told that the regime in the capital had sold them out, that the foreigners saw them as expendable, that the only answer was total revolution. Many believed it, or had no other structure left to turn to. The line from American bombs to the Khmer Rouge's later genocide is not simple or singular. Cambodian history, internal elites, regional politics all played roles. But the bombing campaign helped create the conditions: a devastated countryside, radicalized peasants, discredited moderates, and an atmosphere where extreme solutions could take root. For critics of Kissinger, this is where the story of strategy shades into the story of crime. They point to the deliberate secrecy, the falsified records, the bypassing of Congress as a conscious decision to wage illegal war. They note that Kissinger was not a distant spectator, but a central architect, reviewing targets, pushing for pressure, intertwining the bombing with his negotiating tactics. They highlight the scale of civilian casualties and the predictable political destabilization that followed. They argue that this was not a tragic accident of war, but the foreseeable outcome of dropping millions of tons of explosives on one of the poorest countries on earth while lying about it. Supporters respond that the North Vietnamese had turned Cambodia into a battlefield first, that sanctuaries violated neutrality before the first B-52 crossed the border, that any serious attempt to end the war had to strike at these rear areas. They emphasize intent, to shorten the conflict, to save lives in the long run by increasing pressure now. Between those positions lies a grim record. A neutral country was secretly bombed on presidential orders. Reporting channels were deliberately manipulated to conceal the operation from Congress and the public. Hundreds of thousands of civilians suffered. The political system of Cambodia cracked, and from the fissures emerged one of the 20th century's most murderous regimes. For those who argue that Kissinger's diplomacy crossed into criminality, Cambodia sits near the center of the indictment. It embodies the pattern, the belief that grand strategy and realpolitik permit almost anything, so long as it remains deniable, so long as it is justified as leverage in some larger game. And as the craters in Cambodia were still fresh, the same logic was being applied next door, in another country that was never supposed to be part of the war at all. On maps in Washington, Laos was mostly mountains and rivers, a landlocked shape wedged between Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and China. It was poor, sparsely populated, and officially neutral under international agreements. On the Pentagon's internal maps, it looked very different. Through eastern Laos ran a web of paths, roads, and storage depots known collectively as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was not a single road, but a constantly shifting lattice of tracks, pipelines, and way stations. Men and supplies moved down from North Vietnam through Laotian territory, then back into South Vietnam to sustain the war. If you were an American planner trying to win, or at least not lose in Vietnam, that lattice was infuriating. Your enemy's lifeline ran through a country you were not supposed to touch. To Nixon and Kissinger, Laos presented the same kind of problem as Cambodia, just even more hidden from view. It was both a logistical challenge and a tempting pressure point. If the trail could be severed or made untenable, the balance of the war might shift. If it could be attacked out of the spotlight, the domestic political risks might be manageable. The solution again was a shadow war. Officially, the United States had signed on to Geneva agreements promising to respect Laotian neutrality. Publicly, American officials described the conflict in Laos, when they mentioned it at all, as a small local problem, a civil war between the royal government and a communist movement known as the Pathet Lao, backed by North Vietnam. Privately, the Central Intelligence Agency built an entire parallel military. In the early 1960s, the CIA began recruiting from ethnic minorities in Laos, especially the Hmong people in the rugged north. They armed, trained, and paid tens of thousands of men who, on paper, were local irregulars defending their homeland. In reality, they became a proxy army, directed by American case officers, fighting North Vietnamese units and Pathet Lao forces, guarding radar sites, rescuing downed American pilots, and trying to harass the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was a war with no uniforms, no clear front lines, and crucially, very little paper trail in the United States. Funding moved through covert budgets, casualties were tallied quietly, if at all. When American aircraft supported these forces, the missions were classified, the coordinates obscure, the public statements vague, and the air war over Laos was massive. From 1964 to 1973, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laotian soil. By some calculations, Laos became the most heavily bombed country per capita in human history. For 9 years, American planes flew hundreds of thousands of sorties in what was officially not a war. It was divided into code names and zones. Barrel Roll in the north, where CIA-backed forces fought to hold the Plain of Jars and shield navigational beacons. Steel Tiger and Tiger Hound in the east and south, where strike aircraft and B-52s hunted trucks, storage areas, and anything that looked like part of the trail. Villages sat inside those zones. So did rice paddies, temples, schools, and forests where people hid when the engines approached. Stated targets were infiltration routes, truck parks, and enemy encampments. In practice, pilots often flew in bad weather, through thick clouds, with limited visibility. They were guided by crude sensors, ground spotters under fire, and ambiguous intelligence. The bombing grids were broad. If suspicious movement was reported near a hamlet, the hamlet might simply disappear under high explosives and cluster munitions. In Washington, this was described in abstract language, interdicting supply lines, degrading enemy capacity, raising the cost to Hanoi. To maintain deniability, officials framed American involvement in Laos as minimal, advisory, peripheral. When pressed by Congress, they emphasized that there were few, if any, U.S. ground combat units, that this was largely a local struggle. The scale of the bombing was classified. The existence of the CIA's proxy forces was not admitted. The public understanding of what was happening in Laos was kept deliberately blurry, folded into technical briefings and maps that most people never saw. Kissinger stepped into this system and intensified it. For him, Laos, like Cambodia, was a lever. Pressure on the trail could complement pressure around Saigon. Attrition in the Laotian highlands could feed into bargaining positions in Paris. If you believed that adversaries responded to pain and risk, then turning up the dial in the shadows seemed logical. So the sorties continued, and in some periods increased, even as withdrawal from South Vietnam was being advertised at home. The United States could talk about Vietnamization and troop reductions while still pouring explosives onto the mountains and valleys of a neighboring state that few Americans could find on a globe. For people in those valleys, neutrality became an abstraction with no protective power. Entire districts were emptied as villagers fled bombing corridors. Hmong communities, tied closely to the CIA campaign, suffered staggering losses in combat and reprisal. When the war finally ended and the communist Pathet Lao took full control of the country, tens of thousands of Hmong fled across the Mekong into Thailand, many eventually resettling as refugees in the United States, carrying memories of a war most of their new neighbors had never heard of. Then there were the bombs that did not explode. American aircraft dropped vast quantities of cluster munitions over Laos, canisters that opened in midair, scattering hundreds of small submunitions across fields and forests. A significant percentage of those bomblets failed to detonate on impact. They burrowed into soil, lodged in riverbeds, or lay exposed where children could find them. After 1973, after the last American planes left, after the headlines moved on, those bomblets remained. For decades, Laotian farmers have hit them with plows. Children have picked them up, mistaking them for toys or scrap metal. Livestock have stepped on them. Each contact can trigger an explosion, tearing bodies apart in peacetime the way they were meant to in war. Estimates suggest that up to a third of the cluster submunitions dropped on Laos remain unexploded. Millions of small, unstable explosives embedded in the landscape, turning routine tasks, planting rice, digging a post hole, walking to school into calculated risks. International clearance teams have been working for years, but progress is slow, the terrain difficult, the scale overwhelming. The humanitarian effects go beyond immediate casualties. Fields rendered dangerous mean less arable land. Fear of digging new irrigation or building new homes slows development. Generations grow up constrained by decisions made in secret meetings far away, long before they were born. Laos, in this sense, is not just a footnote to Vietnam. It is an example of how a hidden escalation can echo long after its architects have moved on to other matters. For Kissinger's defenders, the air war and covert campaign in Laos were part of a broader struggle in Indochina, driven by North Vietnamese decisions to use Laotian territory as a conduit. They argue that ignoring the trail would have been tantamount to conceding defeat, that the responsibility lies primarily with those who internationalized the conflict in the first place. For his critics, Laos is another entry in the same pattern already visible in Cambodia, a willingness to expand violence into formally neutral countries, to cloak that expansion in secrecy and euphemism, and to discount the predictable human toll so long as the moves fit within a larger framework of leverage and realpolitik. It is a pattern that would reappear in other forms. Side theaters turned into pressure points, deniable operations used to avoid public debate, long-term consequences treated as someone else's problem. As the shadow war in Laos burned through villages and mountains, the official search for peace with honor in Vietnam continued, framed for the American public as a careful drawdown and a diplomatic achievement waiting just over the horizon. While bombs fell on Cambodia and Laos, another war unfolded at conference tables in Paris. The official story was that negotiations there would bring an honorable peace, a way to end America's longest war without admitting defeat. The reality was slower, more stubborn, and far more brutal. Peace talks between the United States and North Vietnam had been going on, in fits and starts since the late Johnson years. Public sessions began in 1968, full of speeches, formalities, and posturing. Nixon and Kissinger thought they could do better behind closed doors. So they opened a second channel, secret meetings between Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, the senior North Vietnamese negotiator and Politburo member. Tho was a revolutionary who had spent years in French colonial prisons. He was not easily impressed by Harvard professors or White House titles. The two men met in safe houses outside Paris, in villas with guarded gates and carefully arranged schedules. Their conversations stretched for hours. Kissinger came with maps, proposals, and threats. Tho came with a simple baseline. The United States had to get out, and South Vietnam's government, as Washington had built it, was not legitimate in Hanoi's eyes. The central deadlock was straightforward. The United States wanted a peace that kept the South Vietnamese government in place, at least for a while, and gave it a chance to stand on its own. North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front wanted a political settlement that would ultimately bring about unification under their control. Both sides wanted a deal that looked like something other than surrender. Kissinger brought his theory of leverage to the table. Each bombing campaign, each escalation in Cambodia or Laos, was meant to increase pressure on Hanoi, to show that the war would get worse, not better, if they refused to compromise. In his view, military pain and diplomatic progress were two halves of the same strategy. Le Duc Tho had his own theory. He believed time and casualties were on his side. American public opinion was eroding. Anti-war protests were growing. Congress was getting restless. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were still fighting, still infiltrating, still willing to absorb losses that would have broken most armies. Though calculated that if he simply did not give in, the Americans would eventually leave. For years, the talks moved in circles. Proposals and counterproposals, pauses and walkouts, angry statements to the press when it suited each side. All the while, the killing continued in villages, jungles, and cities thousands of miles away. By 1972, however, the balance around the table began to shift. Nixon's policy of Vietnamization had reduced American ground troops in South Vietnam. The war was increasingly fought by South Vietnamese forces with American air support. At the same time, Hanoi launched a major conventional offensive, the Easter Offensive, testing whether Saigon's army could hold without hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers on the ground. American air power in South Vietnamese units eventually blunted the attack, but it was a close-run thing. The offensive showed both how fragile Saigon was and how costly continued fighting could be for the North. The domestic clock in the United States kept ticking. Nixon faced re-election. Pressure from Congress to cut off funding was intensifying. In this context, the outlines of a deal hardened. The agreement Kissinger and Le Duc Tho finally reached, announced in January 1973, had a few key elements. The United States would withdraw all its remaining combat troops and dismantle its bases in South Vietnam. American prisoners of war would be released. There would be a ceasefire in place across all of Vietnam. On paper, the political future of South Vietnam would be decided by national reconciliation and negotiations between the Saigon government and a new national council that included communist representatives. In practice, this meant freezing the military map in place. North Vietnamese forces were allowed to remain in the south, in the positions they held when the ceasefire took effect. This was the heart of the bargain. America would go home. Hanoi would get its troops left legally in South Vietnam. Saigon would survive, at least for the moment, behind a facade of diplomatic language about self-determination and political processes. Nixon and Kissinger sold this as peace with honor. The phrase sounded soothing. It suggested that the United States had not been driven out, that it was choosing to leave under terms it had shaped, with its allies still standing. It implied a dignified end to a messy war, a turning of the page rather than a confession of failure. Television viewers saw images of returning POWs and departing American units. Speeches emphasized that South Vietnam would have a decent chance to defend itself, that American promises had been kept, that peace had been secured through strength and perseverance. In Norway, the Nobel Committee went further. In October 1973, it awarded the Nobel Peace Prize jointly to Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho for their efforts in negotiating a ceasefire in Vietnam. Kissinger accepted. Le Duc Tho declined. He stated that there was no real peace in Vietnam, that fighting continued, that the agreement was not being honored on the ground. It was an unusually blunt assessment for a Nobel announcement, and it undercut the theater of closure that the prize was supposed to provide. The award itself became one of the most controversial in the prize's history. Several members of the Nobel Committee resigned in protest. Critics pointed out that the bombing of Cambodia and Laos had been part of the same strategy now being honored. They noted that the ceasefire was fragile, violations frequent, and that no true political settlement had been reached. For many observers, what Kissinger had achieved was not so much peace as a carefully staged American exit. The deal removed U.S. forces and secured the return of American prisoners, central concerns for Washington's domestic politics. It did not require North Vietnam to withdraw its troops from the South. It did not guarantee the survival of the Saigon government beyond the immediate future. It pushed the most difficult questions: who would actually rule South Vietnam, and under what system, into a vague future that American officials knew they might not be around to see. Within 2 years, the scaffolding of peace with honor collapsed. As Watergate consumed Nixon's presidency and Congress cut back military aid, South Vietnam's already weak position eroded. In early 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a new offensive. This time, there was no large-scale American intervention to stop them. Provinces fell in rapid succession, refugees clogged the roads, panic spread through Saigon. In April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the South Vietnamese capital. Helicopters lifted desperate evacuees from the roof of the U.S. Embassy. The flag of the Republic of Vietnam was lowered for the last time. The state Washington had spent years and enormous resources defending simply ceased to exist. The 1973 agreement had bought time, but not stability. It had provided a legal and rhetorical framework for withdrawal, but not a lasting peace. For Kissinger's admirers, it was the best that could have been achieved under impossible circumstances. For his critics, it was a face-saving device, a way to rebrand defeat as honor, and to step away from a catastrophe without fully acknowledging its cost. The phrase remained, smooth and comforting, peace with honor. The images remained too, the final bombardments, the overcrowded boats, the unanswered questions about what exactly had been honored, and by whom. While the war in Vietnam wound down on uncomfortable terms, Nixon and Kissinger were already focused on something else. A bigger chessboard, a way to reshape the entire Cold War by rearranging its pieces. For decades, American strategy had treated the communist world as one solid block. Moscow and Beijing were lumped together as a single monolith. In reality, they had been drifting apart for years. The Sino-Soviet split was not an overnight argument. It grew out of ideology, ego, and borders. After Stalin's death, Mao Zedong and the Chinese leadership began to resent Soviet condescension. Moscow lectured Beijing on how to build socialism, cut off some aid, and pursued peaceful coexistence with the West. Mao saw that as weakness. He accused the Soviets of betraying the revolution. By the early 1960s, the two sides were trading insults in public. Soviet and Chinese propagandists denounced each other as revisionists and adventurists. In 1969, the split turned hot along the Ussuri River. Soviet and Chinese troops exchanged fire over disputed islands. There were real fears inside both governments of a larger war between the world's two biggest communist powers. To Nixon and Kissinger, this was not just a quarrel. It was an opening. If the United States could exploit the rift, it could stop thinking of the Cold War as Washington versus a united communist front. Instead, it could turn it into a triangle: Beijing, Moscow, Washington, three centers of power, each wary of the others. In such a triangle, America did not have to be isolated. It could play the middle. Kissinger's logic was simple and cold. If the Soviet Union worried that China and the United States might work together, it would be more cautious, more willing to negotiate on arms control and Europe. If China feared Soviet encirclement, it might see value in some understanding with America, even after 2 decades of hostility and propaganda. But first, someone had to talk to Beijing, quietly. Officially, the United States and the People's Republic of China did not even recognize each other. Washington still treated the nationalist government on Taiwan as the real China and blocked Beijing's seat at the United Nations. American and Chinese troops had fought each other in Korea. Chinese propaganda called U.S. leaders imperialist warmongers. American rhetoric depicted Mao's China as a fanatical, unstable regime. So the opening began with theater, signals, indirect gestures, ping-pong players visiting China, editorials in controlled newspapers. Messages passed through Pakistan, Romania, and other intermediaries. Hints that both sides were willing to move, if the other did not humiliate them in the process. In July 1971, the secret phase turned into something more concrete. Kissinger flew to Pakistan for what looked like routine consultations. While there, he claimed to have fallen ill and disappeared from public view. The official story was that he was resting at a secluded guest house. In reality, he boarded a Pakistani jet and flew to Beijing. It was a carefully staged operation, travel documents under code names. A limited circle of people in the know. No public schedule. No press. For nearly 2 days, Henry Kissinger was in the capital of a country the United States officially did not recognize, meeting with Chinese leaders, while the rest of the world thought he was in bed with a stomach bug. In Beijing, he was received by Premier Zhou Enlai, one of the revolution's old hands. Zhou had been there through civil war, Japanese invasion, the founding of the People's Republic, and the Cultural Revolution's chaos. He was a survivor, a patient negotiator, and he had not forgotten that in 1954, at Geneva, John Foster Dulles had refused to shake his hand. Now an American envoy came to him in secret, asking to reshape the world. Those first talks were about principles and possibilities. The two sides agreed that they shared a common concern about Soviet power. They discussed Vietnam, Taiwan, and the general shape of an eventual presidential visit. The choreography mattered. China needed to show it was not bending the knee to an old enemy. The United States needed to show it was not betraying allies overnight. Every word, every phrase had to serve several audiences at once: Beijing's hardliners, Washington's hawks, Moscow's intelligence services, and nervous governments in Asia and Europe. The secret trip led to the public spectacle. In February 1972, Richard Nixon flew to China. Television audiences saw him shaking hands with Mao, touring the Great Wall, toasting in the Great Hall of the People. Behind those images was a document that mattered far more than the banquets: the Shanghai Communique. Issued at the end of the visit, it was a joint statement of where the two countries stood and where they hoped to go. Its language on Taiwan became a classic example of diplomatic ambiguity. The United States declared that it acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The phrase was carefully chosen. Washington did not explicitly endorse Beijing's claim. It acknowledged that the Chinese themselves claimed it. The communiqué also stated that the United States would gradually reduce its military forces and installations on Taiwan, and that both sides sought a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. For Beijing, this was a major step. It broke decades of U.S. diplomatic isolation, moved China closer to the United Nations seat it would soon obtain, and implicitly accepted that Taiwan would not be a permanent separate state backed by American treaty guarantees forever. For Washington, the ambiguity provided room to maneuver. The United States did not abandon Taiwan outright. It maintained unofficial ties, arms sales, and a lingering security commitment, while opening a channel to the world's most populous country. Beyond Taiwan, the communiqué signaled a new alignment. Both sides expressed concern about any one power seeking hegemony in Asia, a phrase understood in Moscow as a warning. The triangular game was now official. The impact on the global balance of power was immediate and long-lasting. The Soviet Union suddenly faced the prospect of strategic encirclement. To its west, NATO. To its east, a China no longer fully hostile to Washington. Within a few years, Moscow sought relief through Détente, strategic arms limitation talks, and a more cautious posture. China gained recognition, access to Western technology, and a counterweight against the Soviet threat. Its long path toward economic opening and integration with the global system began, slowly from that diplomatic thaw. The United States gained leverage. It could play Beijing and Moscow against each other, reduce the risk of a unified communist front, and claim a bold, imaginative stroke in an otherwise grim era. For admirers of Henry Kissinger, the opening to China is the jewel in the crown. Proof, they argue, that he was a master strategist who could see patterns others missed, who could turn ideological enemies into useful partners, who could think several moves ahead on the global chessboard. For critics, the achievement is real, but not absolving. It did not erase the secret bombings, the civilian deaths, or the support for dictators elsewhere. It showed how far Kissinger was willing to go for balance of power advantage, but also how little moral constraint entered into his calculus. The door to China opened. The Cold War triangle shifted. The world's map of alliances and enmities changed in quieter ways than the roar of bombers, but no less profoundly. From Beijing, the road led back to Moscow. The same logic that brought Kissinger to Joe's guest house would soon carry him into Soviet dachas and chandeliered halls, searching for limits to an arms race that had already gone far beyond human comprehension. Détente is a French word that sounds gentle, a relaxation, a loosening of tension. In the Cold War, it became the label for something more specific, an attempt to manage rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, not by ending it, but by putting guardrails around it. For Henry Kissinger, détente was not a peace movement. It was a tool. In his triangular design, Washington stood between Beijing and Moscow. The opening to China had already signaled to the Soviets that the United States could find common cause with their most dangerous neighbor. Now, he wanted to use that pressure to draw the Soviet Union into a more predictable relationship. The logic was brutally simple. If both communist giants feared each other more than they feared the United States, each might accept limits with Washington. The triangle would stabilize the line between nuclear superpowers, even while smaller countries continued to bear the brunt of proxy wars, coups, and covert operations. So détente was never about friendship. It was about risk management. By the late 1960s, the arms race had reached absurd levels. The United States and the Soviet Union had built enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet many times over. New delivery systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, multiple warheads on a single rocket were making the numbers less important than the speed and complexity of apocalypse. Both sides were also beginning to explore anti-ballistic missile systems, ABMs, designed to shoot down incoming nuclear warheads. On paper, this sounded like defense. In reality, it threatened to make things worse. If one side could reliably block a retaliatory strike, it might be tempted to launch a first strike. If both sides chased ABM shields, each would feel compelled to expand its offensive arsenal to overwhelm the other's defenses. The result would be more missiles, more warheads, more money, more fear. Kissinger saw an opening in that shared nightmare. Negotiations that had begun under Lyndon Johnson were revived. Strategic arms limitation talks, SALT. The process was slow, technical, and sometimes theatrical. In May 1972, after the spectacle of Nixon in Beijing came another spectacle, Nixon in Moscow. The Moscow summit produced two cornerstone agreements. The first was the ABM Treaty. Both sides agreed to strict limits on anti-ballistic missile systems. Initially, each could deploy ABM defenses at only two sites, one to protect the capital, one to protect an ICBM field. Later, that was cut to one. The idea was not to make either country safe from nuclear attack. It was to preserve mutual vulnerability. In Kissinger's cold grammar, this was strategic stability. If both sides knew that any nuclear war would still mean their own destruction, neither would be tempted to start one. The ABM Treaty was, in effect, an agreement to remain exposed, to keep the balance of terror intact. The second agreement was the SALT-I Interim Agreement. It froze the number of certain kinds of strategic launchers, ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, each side could deploy. It did not reduce existing arsenals. It did not stop ongoing modernization. It simply put a ceiling, for 5 years, on a race that had been spiraling upward without formal constraint. Around these agreements, Nixon and Brezhnev wrapped the language of peaceful coexistence and constructive relations. The summit featured toasts, handshakes, and photographs of smiling leaders who, a decade earlier, had been staring at each other across the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis. For a world that had learned to live with the idea of 45 minutes to doomsday, the image of the superpower signing documents that at least acknowledged limits was a kind of sedative. It did not remove the weapons, but it suggested that the people who controlled them were slightly less interested in rolling the dice. But détente was never meant to end the ideological conflict between capitalism and communism. The Soviet Union remained a one-party police state. The United States continued to see itself as leader of the free world, even as it supported dictatorships from Tehran to Santiago. Both sides continued to arm clients, intervene in civil wars, and conduct espionage on a global scale. The theory was that by stabilizing the central nuclear relationship, they could compete more safely on the periphery. A kind of managed hostility. Not everyone found this reassuring. In the United States, conservative critics saw détente as appeasement dressed up in graduate school vocabulary. They argued that the Soviet Union was using negotiations as cover to keep expanding its influence in the Third World and building up newer, more accurate missiles. Freezing numbers did not freeze ambition. Future hardliners like Ronald Reagan would later point to the 1970s as a decade when Washington let Moscow gain ground under the pleasant haze of summits and signatures. To them, Kissinger and Nixon were too willing to accept parity, too quick to treat the Soviet Union as a legitimate, permanent partner rather than an adversary to be defeated. On the other side, liberal critics attacked détente from a different angle. They saw the handshakes in Moscow and the trade agreements that followed as a betrayal of human rights and democratic ideals. The Soviet regime still jailed dissidents, sent writers and activists to labor camps, crushed attempts at political freedom in Eastern Europe. How could the United States sign friendship documents while Soviet tanks had only recently rolled through Prague and while political prisoners languished in the Gulag? Some argued that linkage, the idea that economic and political benefits for Moscow should be tied to better behavior abroad and at home, was weakly applied. The reality, in their view, was that strategic arms control and grain deals went forward, while Soviet dissidents were left to write appeals that rarely changed policy. For Kissinger, these criticisms missed the point. He believed that moral purity was a luxury in a nuclear age. The primary task was to prevent world war. Everything else, ideological posturing, human rights rhetoric, domestic political theater, was secondary. Détente, in his mind, made nuclear catastrophe less likely. That was enough. Whether that calculus comforts or disturbs depends on how you weigh lives saved by avoiding a nuclear exchange against lives lost in the slower violence of dictatorship, proxy wars, and suppressed freedoms. The documents of Détente did not quiet the Cold War. They did not bring democracy to the Soviet bloc or justice to its victims. They did something narrower and, in Kissinger's eyes, more essential. They made the rivalry between superpowers more predictable, less prone to sudden, existential miscalculation. As the pens dried in Moscow and the cameras switched off, the limits of that approach were already becoming visible in countries where ballots were fragile, generals impatient, and American support could tip the balance between reform and repression. One of those countries was Chile. In 1970, Chile held a democratic election that produced a result Washington did not like. Salvador Allende, a Marxist physician and longtime socialist politician, won a narrow plurality in a three-way race. Under Chile's constitution, Congress then had to choose between the top two candidates. Allende was confirmed as president. Chile was not Cuba. It had a long tradition of constitutional rule, competitive parties, and civilian control of the military. Allende did not seize power with guerrillas. He won it with votes. For many Chileans on the left, his victory was an experiment. Could a socialist transformation be carried out peacefully, through law and parliament, rather than revolution and firing squads? For the Nixon White House, it was something else, the nightmare of what they called another Cuba, but this time achieved by ballot boxes, not beards in jungle warfare. Even before Allende took office, Nixon and Kissinger discussed how to respond. The president's view was blunt. He reportedly told the CIA to make the economy scream in Chile. Kissinger's comments, preserved in notes and later testimony, capture the mindset. In one meeting he said that he did not see why the United States should stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people. That sentence has followed him ever since. To Kissinger, democracy was never sacred in itself. It was valuable when it produced governments aligned with American interests and global stability as he defined it. When voters chose a path he believed would threaten those interests or encourage similar choices elsewhere, democracy became a problem to be managed. The management in Chile was covert. In 1970, Washington tried to prevent Allende from ever being sworn in. The CIA was authorized to explore two tracks. One was political, fund opposition parties, newspapers, and campaigns inside Congress to block his confirmation. The other was more drastic, encourage elements of the Chilean military to intervene. That second track led to contacts with officers who opposed Allende and to discussions of a possible coup before he took office. One plot centered on General René Schneider, the Chilean army's commander-in-chief. Schneider was not a leftist, but he was strongly committed to the Constitution. He insisted the military had no right to block a legally elected president. To those seeking a preemptive intervention, that commitment made him an obstacle. In October 1970, Schneider was ambushed and fatally wounded by conspirators trying to kidnap him. The CIA had supplied weapons and support to groups plotting against him, though the exact chain of responsibility remains tangled in redactions and conflicting memories. The attempt to stop Allende's inauguration failed. He took office. But the effort did not end there. It changed shape. For the next 3 years, U.S. policy aimed to isolate and weaken his government. Economic aid was cut. Loans from international institutions were discouraged. The CIA covertly funded opposition media, strikes, and political parties. These steps did not topple Allende by themselves. Chile had deep internal conflicts over land reform, nationalization of copper mines, inflation, and class power. But American pressure amplified every fracture. Over time, Chile's economy deteriorated. Inflation soared. Strikes paralyzed key sectors. The atmosphere grew more polarized, crowded with fear, rumors, and armed groups on both the far left and the far right. Inside the Chilean military, officers who believed themselves guardians of order watched this turmoil with increasing alarm. Some were encouraged, quietly, by signals that Washington would not object if they intervened. This is where the question of Kissinger's responsibility becomes sharper and also more complicated. There is no declassified document in which he orders a specific coup on a specific date. The September 11, 1973 military takeover that toppled Allende was planned and executed by Chilean generals, chief among them Augusto Pinochet, who had recently become commander-in-chief. But there is abundant evidence that Kissinger helped create an environment in which such a coup was expected, welcomed, and supported after the fact. He chaired the 40 Committee, which oversaw covert operations. That committee approved millions of dollars in funding for Chilean opposition groups. He briefed Nixon on efforts to destabilize Allende's government. He pressed for economic pressure, knowing it would worsen the crisis. After the coup, as reports of mass arrests, torture, and disappearances under Pinochet's new junta flowed in, Kissinger consistently argued against cutting ties or applying serious pressure on human rights grounds. In 1976, when Pinochet's regime was already notorious for secret prisons and death flights, Kissinger told the Chilean foreign minister that the United States was sympathetic and that human rights concerns in Congress were a domestic problem he had to manage. Covert influence, indirect encouragement, and deliberate tolerance are not the same as signing a coup order, but they are not neutral either. They are forms of power exercised in the shadows. On the morning of September 11, 1973, Chilean jet fighters bombed the presidential palace. Allende, refusing to surrender, died inside, whether by suicide or in battle, became part of Chile's contested memory. Pinochet emerged as the dominant figure in a military junta that soon concentrated power in his hands. In the stadiums and secret detention centers that followed, thousands of Chileans were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. Tens of thousands were exiled. Political parties were banned. The experiment in democratic socialism ended in smoke and blood. For Kissinger, Chile was one more tile in the global mosaic, a local adjustment in a larger strategy. A Marxist government had been removed, a reliable anti-communist ally installed. In his calculus, the risk of a left-wing model succeeding through elections in Latin America had been reduced. For his critics, Chile became the definitive example of what American freedom meant when filtered through realpolitik, a readiness to undermine democracy when it delivered the wrong winners, and to embrace dictatorship when it served perceived interests. The debate over his role turns on those distinctions, between giving a direct order and creating conditions, between plausible deniability and moral responsibility. Even if the coup was made in Chile, as defenders insist, it unfolded on ground that Washington had helped till. Chile's story sits at the center of a larger argument that follows Kissinger's name. Whether the United States can claim to protect a democratic world order while quietly toppling elected governments that choose a different path. Chile was not the only place where Kissinger's calculations about power collided with questions of principle. 3 years earlier, on the other side of the world, a different crisis had unfolded, less visible in Western memory, but even bloodier. It took place in what was then East Pakistan, a densely populated, Bengali-speaking region separated from the rest of Pakistan by 1,000 miles of Indian territory. In 1970, Pakistan held national elections. For the first time, the vote was broadly free and competitive. The result was clear. A party based in East Pakistan, the Awami League, won an outright majority in the National Assembly. Under any normal reading of parliamentary democracy, that meant its leader, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, should form the government of Pakistan. But Pakistan was not a normal democracy. Since independence, the state had been dominated by elites from West Pakistan, its army, its bureaucracy, its political class. They were not willing to hand over power to a Bengali party they distrusted, one that demanded autonomy and threatened the existing balance. As negotiations dragged on and hopes for a peaceful transfer of power dimmed, tensions in East Pakistan rose. On March 25, 1971, the Pakistani military launched Operation Searchlight, a brutal crackdown aimed at crushing Bengali nationalism. Troops moved into the universities, neighborhoods, and villages of East Pakistan. They targeted students, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of supporting autonomy. Hindu minorities were singled out for special violence. Over the following months, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Some estimates run much higher, into the millions. Rape was used systematically, villages were burned, a massive refugee crisis spilled across the border into neighboring India. By late 1971, roughly 10 million Bengalis had fled. Inside Pakistan, this was presented as an internal security matter, the suppression of separatists and Indian agents. To those on the ground, including American diplomats, it looked like something closer to genocide. This is where the Nixon administration's choices become stark. In 1971, Pakistan's ruler was General Yahya Khan, a military dictator. He was also, crucially, the intermediary Nixon and Kissinger were using to open a secret channel to Beijing. The United States and the People's Republic of China had no formal relations. Pakistan, friendly with both, served as a bridge. In July 1971, Kissinger made his famous secret trip to China. Officially, he had gone to Pakistan on a routine visit. Then, he vanished from public view, supposedly ill and resting. In reality, Pakistan had flown him to Beijing. That trip set in motion the dramatic US-China opening that would be announced later and overshadow much else. For Nixon and Kissinger, Yahya Khan was not just another ruler. He was our man in a strategically crucial back channel. They valued him highly. They did not want to risk that relationship by pressuring him over what his army was doing in East Pakistan. So as reports of mass killings, rapes, and burning villages poured in, the White House line stayed supportive of Islamabad. U.S. military aid to Pakistan continued. Public statements were mild. Privately, Nixon and Kissinger expressed sympathy for Yahya, irritation with India, and contempt for the Bengali leadership. Some of their conversations, preserved on the Nixon tapes, are jarring to read. They discuss India's Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, in crude and hostile terms. They frame the crisis as a geopolitical competition in which India, aligned with the Soviet Union, is the main villain, and Pakistan, aligned with the United States and China, is the embattled friend. Within the American government, not everyone agreed. In Dhaka, the principal U.S. diplomat Archer Blood and many of his staff watched the crackdown up close. They saw bodies in the streets, heard gunfire, took testimony from survivors. They sent cable after cable to Washington describing what they were witnessing. In April 1971, Blood helped draft what became one of the most famous dissent cables in State Department history. Signed by dozens of American officials, it stated bluntly that the United States was bypassing consistent policy objectives by failing to denounce the atrocities. The authors accused the administration of moral complicity, saying that U.S. policy was in moral conflict with the American public opinion and with basic human values. The cable called the events in East Pakistan a selective genocide. At the time, the State Department had just created a formal dissent channel so that diplomats could express disagreement without fear of retaliation. The Blood telegram was an early, dramatic test of that idea. It did not change Nixon's or Kissinger's course. It did, however, mark a line in the historical record, American officials stating in real time that what was happening was wrong and that their own government was failing to respond. The response from above was chilly. Blood was removed from his post and reassigned. In later years, Kissinger would dismiss critics of the policy as emotional or naive, insufficiently attuned to the harsh necessities of strategy. Strategy in this case meant several things at once. First, it meant protecting the Pakistan-China channel at almost any cost. Kissinger saw the opening to Beijing as a potential masterstroke that would reshape the Cold War balance. In that light, the fate of Bengalis under Pakistani rule became a secondary, even tertiary concern. He could not, or would not, risk offending Yahya Khan while still needing his help. Second, it meant seeing the entire crisis through the lens of rivalry with India and the Soviet Union. When India finally intervened militarily in December 1971, partly in response to the refugee burden, partly to weaken Pakistan, the conflict widened into a short, sharp war. The Indian army quickly overran Pakistani forces in the east. East Pakistan declared independence as Bangladesh. The war ended in less than 2 weeks. Through that period, Nixon and Kissinger tilted hard toward Pakistan. They sent an aircraft carrier group, the USS Enterprise, into the Bay of Bengal, a symbolic show of support that alarmed India and many observers. Kissinger later framed India's victory as a Soviet-backed triumph and Pakistan's defeat as a blow to Western interests. Third, strategy meant accepting mass violence as an internal matter so long as it occurred within an ally's borders and did not directly threaten broader balances of power. The logic was similar to Chile, but the scale of killing was larger, and the evidence of atrocities even more immediate. This is why the Bangladesh crisis occupies a special place in assessments of Kissinger's legacy. Unlike covert coups or distant bombing campaigns, this was a case where the human cost was already visible while decisions were being made. American diplomats were reporting massacres. Refugee flows were on the news. Senate hearings raised alarm. The administration knew and continued the policy anyway. There was no ambiguity about whether Washington understood what was happening. The question was whether it cared enough to let moral revulsion override geopolitical priorities. The record suggests that, in this instance, it did not. Defenders argued that the United States had limited leverage, that Pakistan's generals would not have changed course under American pressure, and that bigger strategic gains, the China opening, the alignment against the Soviet Union, justified maintaining ties. They note that eventually, through war and independence, Bangladesh emerged as a separate state. Critics see something different, a test of whether realpolitik has any red lines. Here was a mass killing, described by America's own representatives as genocidal. Here was a chance to cut military aid, to publicly condemn, to distance the United States from a repressive ally. Instead, the White House chose silence and support in service of a larger strategic play. In that choice, they argue, the mask of moral language slipped. The talk of defending freedom and human rights, so often invoked in speeches, was set aside when it conflicted with a favored dictator and a crucial diplomatic channel. Bangladesh is therefore remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a mirror. It reflects a version of Kissinger's worldview stripped to its core: borders and balances, allies and adversaries, great power maneuvers across a map. In that view, the lives of distant civilians count only when they affect the calculus of power. When they do not, their suffering can be bracketed off, acknowledged in private, and ignored in policy. For those who lived through 1971 in East Pakistan, who lost families, homes, or entire communities, that bracketed silence is part of the story. It is why, when people speak of Kissinger's moral failures, they often say one word first before Chile or Cambodia or anything else. Bangladesh. Bangladesh was one chapter where Kissinger chose a side early and stuck with it, despite the blood. In the Middle East, he stepped into a crisis that could have spiraled into something even worse, and there his instinct for maneuver and leverage produced something closer to a diplomatic success, though not an uncomplicated one. In October 1973, on the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated attack on Israel. It was Yom Kippur. Israeli troops were caught off guard along the Suez Canal and the Golan Heights. For the first few days, Arab armies made real advances, crossing the canal, overrunning positions that had seemed impregnable since 1967. For Israel, the shock was existential. For Washington and Moscow, it was something else, a potential flashpoint for a superpower confrontation. Israel was America's close partner. Egypt and Syria were backed by the Soviet Union, supplied and advised by Moscow. As the war intensified, both superpowers began rushing arms to their clients. The United States organized a major airlift of weapons to Israel. The Soviets did the same for Egypt and Syria. Nuclear arsenals sat in the background of every cable and phone call. In the early days, Nixon was distracted by Watergate and domestic turmoil. Kissinger, now both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, effectively ran the crisis. He watched the battlefield maps and the intelligence reports. He weighed how much aid to send, how quickly, and how visibly. He wanted Israel to survive, but he did not necessarily want it to win too fast or too completely. In Kissinger's logic, a sudden, crushing Israeli victory would leave Arab governments humiliated once again, with no reason to negotiate, and every reason to turn back to Moscow. A disaster for Israel, on the other hand, was unthinkable politically and strategically. So he aimed for something in between. Enough Israeli recovery to restore deterrence, enough Arab success at the beginning to make negotiation desirable. It was crisis management as calibration, as Israeli forces regained the initiative, crossing the canal in the opposite direction, surrounding elements of the Egyptian Third Army. Kissinger moved to contain the risk of escalation. The Soviets, alarmed by the prospect of their clients being encircled, raised the possibility of sending troops. Washington responded by putting U.S. nuclear forces on a higher alert, DEFCON 3, a message not subtle about where the red lines lay. At the same time, a ceasefire was hurriedly drafted at the United Nations. Publicly, it bore the UN's name. Privately, it reflected hours of bargaining between Kissinger and his Soviet counterpart, Anatoly Dobrynin. The resolution called for an immediate end to hostilities, but fighting continued in fits and starts. Israel pushed a bit further. Egypt protested. The Soviets muttered about unilateral action. It was at this point that Kissinger boarded a plane and began what would be called shuttle diplomacy, because Israel refused to sit in the same room with Egypt or Syria, and because the Arab leaders had their own reasons not to appear too close to Jerusalem. Kissinger became the physical link between them. He flew from one capital to another, Jerusalem, Cairo, Damascus, carrying messages, maps, and proposals, hour after hour, day after day. He met repeatedly with Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir and her cabinet, pressing for limited withdrawals and prisoner exchanges. He met with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, who had launched the war in part to break the diplomatic deadlock and recover some national pride after 1967. He met with Syria's Hafez al-Assad, harder, more suspicious, less inclined to smile for American envoys. The first goal was securing the fragile ceasefire. The next was disengagement, separating armies that had been shooting at each other days earlier, creating buffer zones, and setting lines that could hold long enough to prevent another sudden slide into full war. Between Israel and Egypt, Kissinger helped broker an agreement that pulled Israeli forces back from the west bank of the Suez Canal and allowed a UN buffer zone in between. Egyptian forces stayed on the east bank, holding a sliver of Sinai they had retaken in the war. It was not full withdrawal, but it was a change from the total Israeli control of the post-1967 years. Between Israel and Syria, the talks were more tense. The Golan Heights remained under Israeli occupation, but Kissinger persuaded both sides to accept a more modest adjustment of lines and another UN-patrolled zone. The deal included prisoner exchanges and commitments, however uneasy to avoid violations. In Washington, these agreements were hailed as major breakthroughs. For the first time since Israel's creation, the United States, not the United Nations, not the old colonial powers, was the indispensable broker in Arab-Israeli affairs. The oil embargo Arab states had imposed during the war, which had rattled Western economies and produced gasoline lines in American cities, made that role even more central. If anyone wanted relief, they needed Washington. Kissinger understood this and leaned into it. He used the crisis to pry Egypt away from the Soviet orbit, offering U.S. aid and diplomatic support in exchange for Sadat's gradual realignment. Over the next few years, that realignment would become more explicit, culminating later in Egypt's full peace with Israel. This was, from a realpolitik perspective, a triumph. The risk of superpower confrontation in the Middle East receded. Washington's influence deepened. Moscow's diminished. Israel gained a more secure, American-mediated environment. Egypt regained enough land and dignity to claim a kind of victory, then pivoted westward. Yet what the shuttle diplomacy did not do is also part of the story. The disengagement deals left the core Palestinian issue largely untouched. Occupation in the West Bank and Gaza continued. Refugees remained in camps. No comprehensive settlement of borders, sovereignty, or rights was reached. The underlying grievances that had fueled cycles of war and resistance were frozen rather than resolved. Kissinger was explicit about this. He preferred step-by-step arrangements, narrow, concrete agreements that reduced immediate risks without trying to solve everything at once. In his view, pursuing a comprehensive peace was unrealistic, even dangerous. Better to manage conflict than to chase visions. For some, this managerial approach looks pragmatic, even wise. The Middle East is a place where grand plans often fail. For others, it looks like postponing the hardest questions indefinitely, locking in structures of occupation and inequality under the cover of stability. In that sense, the Middle East shuttle shows both sides of Kissinger's method. He prevented a local war from tipping into a global catastrophe. He pulled key states into a diplomatic framework shaped in Washington. He proved that, in the right circumstances, negotiation backed by power could change the map without total victory or total defeat. But he also treated the deeper disputes about land, identity, and justice as variables to be managed rather than problems to be solved. The crises subsided. The instability remained, humming quietly beneath the surface, waiting for future eruptions. For a man who believed in balances more than in endings, that may have felt like success. For those living in the unresolved spaces between those balances, the story looks less complete. Kissinger's rise in Washington was not just about the offices he held. It was about how power itself was organized around him. By the mid-1970s, he wasn't simply an advisor whispering in the president's ear. He was National Security Advisor and Secretary of State at the same time, a concentration of influence no one had held before in American foreign policy. In theory, the National Security Advisor is a staff role, coordinating options for the president. The Secretary of State is the public face of diplomacy, running the State Department. In practice, under Kissinger, those lines blurred. He ran policy from the White House and announced it from the State Department. Ambassadors learned what their own government was doing by reading the morning newspapers or by seeing Kissinger on television. He built networks of back channels, private lines with Soviet, Chinese, and other foreign officials that bypassed traditional diplomats. He cultivated journalists and columnists, feeding them selective leaks that framed him as the indispensable strategist at the center of everything. Inside the government, this created a culture in which information was currency, and Kissinger held most of it. Meetings were tightly controlled. Memos were closely held. The National Security Council process, which was supposed to allow different agencies to argue their views, often became a stage where outcomes had already been decided in Kissinger's office. Secrecy, for him, was not only about national security. It was a tool of leverage. If only a few knew the full picture, then those few could maneuver freely. Other players, Congress, the press, sometimes even cabinet secretaries, would always be reacting after the fact. This approach fit the Nixon White House, which was already deeply suspicious of leaks and critics. The administration created enemies lists. It ordered wiretaps on journalists and officials suspected of talking to the press. It approved break-ins and hush-money schemes that would eventually surface under a single word: Watergate. Kissinger both shaped and was shaped by this atmosphere. On the one hand, he complained about leaks and supported investigations into them. He approved wiretaps on his own staff and on journalists, arguing that unauthorized disclosures could wreck delicate negotiations. On the other hand, he leaked constantly when it suited his purposes. Positive stories about his shuttle diplomacy, his China opening, his brilliant maneuvers often came from information he or his aides quietly supplied. Silence was for opponents, whispered narratives were for allies. When the Watergate scandal broke open, the White House began to crumble. A president who liked to project strength and control suddenly looked embattled and cornered. Domestic legitimacy was collapsing, yet foreign leaders still needed to pick up the phone. Treaties needed to be negotiated, crises needed to be managed. In that vacuum, Kissinger became the guarantor that American foreign policy would continue, even as Nixon's presidency fell apart. He reassured allies that commitments would be honored. He signaled to rivals that, despite the spectacle in Washington, the United States could still act decisively abroad. He quietly negotiated with Congress to preserve certain executive authorities while conceding ground on others. Watergate forced a reckoning over secrecy and abuse of power. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, an attempt to limit the president's ability to send troops into combat without legislative approval. Lawmakers opened investigations into CIA and FBI activities, the Church and Pike committees. They tightened rules on intelligence operations, created permanent oversight committees, and tried to claw back some of the authority that had flowed to the White House during the Vietnam years. Many of the abuses they documented had occurred before Kissinger arrived in Washington or in other corners of the national security state. But his style, secret bombings, back-channel diplomacy, concentration of decision-making in the executive, became part of the broader debate about imperial presidency. Supporters argued that in a nuclear age, with crises flaring across continents, the United States needed a nimble, centralized foreign policy. Endless public argument and congressional micromanagement, they said, could be deadly. Critics replied that this logic had already produced Cambodia, Laos, Chile, and covert operations that Congress and the public learned about years too late, if at all. They saw Kissinger's methods as a warning about what happens when one man and a small circle around him decide questions of war and peace in secret. The legal and ethical questions did not end with Watergate. They persisted. How much authority should a president have to wage war without a declaration? How far could national security go in justifying surveillance of journalists, dissidents, or even government officials? Where was the line between necessary discretion in diplomacy and deliberate evasion of democratic oversight? Kissinger's career lived in the gray zones of those questions, and in many ways he set the template for what came after. Future presidents would embrace the idea of high-profile, personal diplomacy summits, photo ops, breakthrough meetings where the leader stands at the center, and the traditional diplomatic machinery plays catch-up. Back channels continued as a standard tool, from arms control talks to secret overtures in new conflicts. The notion that the president, with a small inner circle of advisors, could decide to use force quickly through airstrikes, special operations, and covert actions became normalized even as Congress debated its theoretical authority. Kissinger left office when the Ford administration ended, but the architecture he helped build of concentrated foreign policy power in the executive, shrouded in layers of classification and justified by the urgency of the moment, remained. It is one of his less visible legacies, humming in the background of every secret memo, every classified briefing, every late-night call where a small group decides what the rest of the country will learn only later, if ever. When Henry Kissinger died in 2023, the reactions were a map of the arguments that had followed him for decades. Some people called him one of the most important diplomats of the 20th century. Others called him a war criminal. Those aren't just loud opinions. They come from two very different ways of measuring what foreign policy is supposed to do. Start with the case for him. Supporters see Kissinger as an architect of strategic stability during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. They point to the opening to China, which ended a quarter-century of isolation between Washington and Beijing, split the communist bloc, and reshaped global politics. They argue that this triangle, United States, Soviet Union, China, gave Washington leverage to manage the Cold War from a position of relative strength. They point to Détente with Moscow, arms control agreements like SALT-I, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, hotlines, crisis management rules. In this view, Kissinger helped build guardrails around a nuclear rivalry that could have destroyed the world by accident or by miscalculation. They note the shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East after the 1973 war, when he flew repeatedly between Cairo, Damascus, and Jerusalem to broker disengagement agreements. Those deals did not bring full peace, but they reduced the risk of immediate large-scale war between Israel and its Arab neighbors. They argue that his willingness to deal with dictators and Democrats alike, to make unsentimental bargains, kept superpower competition from spiraling out of control. To them, he is the realist who understood that in a world of imperfect choices, stability itself can be a moral good, because the alternative is chaos and large-scale war. If you keep your gaze at the level of great powers, missile counts, and summit meetings, this picture has some force. The United States and the Soviet Union did not fight a nuclear war. The Cold War ended without Armageddon. China was tied into a global system instead of remaining a hostile, isolated giant. But drop the camera lower, and the case against him comes into focus. Critics see Kissinger not as a sober guardian of order, but as a symbol of elite cynicism. a man who treated distant populations as expendable instruments in his strategies. They point to the secret bombing of Cambodia and the expanded war in Laos. Hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs dropped on officially neutral countries, with civilians living underneath. They note that these decisions were made with minimal consultation of Congress, shielded from public debate, justified by abstractions like pressure and credibility. They point to Chile, where U.S. efforts to make the economy scream, and support for a military coup helped topple a democratically elected government and usher in years of repression and torture. They point to Bangladesh and Pakistan, where Kissinger and Nixon backed a military regime as it carried out mass killings in East Pakistan, while U.S. diplomats on the ground sent cables describing selective genocide. The White House dismissed those warnings and punished the diplomats who spoke up. For these critics, the pattern is clear. When faced with a choice between human lives on the periphery and perceived strategic advantage at the center, Kissinger usually chose the latter. They see the talk of stability as a way of laundering decisions that inflicted vast, avoidable suffering. There's also the question of time. Even if one accepts that opening to China and Détente produced immediate geopolitical gains, the long-term costs in Indochina, Latin America, and South Asia did not stay confined to the 1970s. In Cambodia and Laos, unexploded ordnance still kills and maims people decades later. The bombing campaigns helped create power vacuums that brutal groups could exploit, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia being the most extreme example. In Chile, the 1973 coup was followed by years of dictatorship, disappearances, and fear. The memory of foreign interference and the knowledge of declassified documents showing U.S. involvement continues to shape politics and distrust of Washington across Latin America. In Bangladesh, the trauma of 1971 massacres, refugees, the sense that great powers treated the crisis as a minor inconvenience in larger strategic games remains part of the national story. It is one of the early chapters in a longer narrative of how global powers engage with South Asia's crises, selectively and often late. So you have a ledger where, on one side, there are arguments about nuclear stability and diplomatic breakthroughs, and on the other there are graveyards, maimed bodies, and long memories. Historians, journalists, and activists disagree fiercely about how to weigh those entries, and even about how much of each line should be attributed to Kissinger personally. Part of the dispute is about evidence and archives. New documents continue to be declassified. Tapes, memos, and cables reveal not just what policies were carried out, but what was said in private jokes, dismissive comments about casualties, worries about domestic politics. Supporters argue that some of the harshest quotes are taken out of context, or that decisions were constrained by circumstances, the domino fears of the Cold War, the domestic backlash against defeat in Vietnam, the actions of local actors whose agency is sometimes minimized in American accounts. Critics counter that the archives show a consistent pattern of choices and language that discounted non-American lives. They point to specific memos initialed by Kissinger, orders he relayed, options he rejected. Another part of the dispute is legal. Some activists and international lawyers argue that the bombing of Cambodia and Laos, the support for certain regimes, and the role in coups and mass killings should be treated not just as policy errors, but as crimes, violations of international law, or at least of emerging norms against targeting civilians and overthrowing elected governments. Others respond that the Cold War era was full of similar actions by multiple powers, that legal standards were murky at the time, and that singling out Kissinger ignores a broader system in which presidents, Congress, and many officials participated. Beneath all of this lies a more basic question. Can you separate effectiveness in foreign policy from the human cost of the methods used? If you define success purely in terms of national interest, deterrence maintained, rivals contained, alliances managed, then Kissinger's record can look impressive. He got agreements signed. He engineered dramatic moves. He kept the machinery of great power politics running. If you widen the lens to include the lives of people in villages under bombing runs, in prisons after coups, in refugee camps after massacres, the meaning of success changes. The calculations that looked cool and rational in a Washington meeting room look very different from the ground. Kissinger himself insisted that statesmen are judged by whether they preserve their nations in a dangerous world, not by whether they met abstract moral tests. His harshest critics insist that any definition of preservation that tolerates mass death abroad is itself a moral failure. Both sides, in their own ways, are grappling with the same dilemma. In a world of competing states, is there a way to practice power without dehumanizing those furthest from it? Kissinger's legacy sits at that fault line, where strategic logic and human consequence collide and never quite resolve. After he left office in 1977, Henry Kissinger did not fade into the background. In some ways, his influence grew quieter, but it also grew wider. He moved into a world of consulting firms, corporate boards, and private advisory roles. CEOs wanted to know how political risk might affect their investments. Presidents and prime ministers wanted to hear how he read the map of power. Young officials, even those who disagreed with him, often felt they had to meet him at least once, to be seen listening. He wrote books, gave lectures, appeared on television. His manner was slow, deliberate, confident. He spoke in the language of history and balance, of systems and equilibriums. For many journalists and talk show hosts, he became a sort of living oracle of statecraft, the man you called when you wanted to know what China was thinking, or how Moscow might react, or whether some regional war might spiral. Even presidents who campaigned against the arrogance of past foreign policies still invited him to the White House. Democratic and Republican administrations alike took his calls. He advised George W. Bush during the War on Terror. He met with Barack Obama's team. He spoke with Donald Trump. Each time, the same pattern: public controversy, private consultation. Part of this endurance came from his story: the refugee from Nazi Germany who became the American who talked to Mao and Brezhnev, the professor who turned his theories into real-world gambits. To some, he embodied a certain idea of hard-headed expertise, the belief that if you understood history deeply enough, you could manage even the most dangerous confrontations. Part of it came from the way foreign policy circles work. Once someone is accepted into the inner ring of strategic thinkers, their phone tends to keep ringing. Foundations invite them. Universities host them. Newspapers print their op-eds. Influence reproduces itself. And part of it came from the simple fact that the dilemmas he wrestled with never really went away. New crises appeared: terrorism, rising China, cyber conflict, but the underlying questions stayed similar. How much risk to run? How much force to use? How to signal resolve without tipping into war? Kissinger's framework of realpolitik, of states pursuing interests in a competitive system, still appealed to leaders facing those choices. At the same time, the moral criticisms did not recede. As archives opened and new generations studied the wars and coups of the late 20th century, campaigners and scholars pressed again for accountability. Petitions called for him to be arrested if he traveled to certain countries. Protesters showed up at his speeches. Articles revisited Cambodia, Chile, Bangladesh, East Timor. So he lived, for decades, in a peculiar dual role: honored guest at elite gatherings and symbol of impunity to those who had buried their dead after policies he helped design. This is the tension that followed him: strategic realism on one side, moral accountability on the other. Strategic realism says that states operate in a dangerous world with no central referee. Someone has to make choices about war and peace, and those choices will never satisfy everyone. It warns that insisting on pure morality can lead to paralysis, or to disasters born of wishful thinking. Moral accountability says that the victims of those choices are not abstractions, that legality and ethics are not optional extras, that the distance between a polished briefing in a capital and the village on the map does not erase responsibility. Kissinger's long afterlife in public life showed how hard it is for political systems to hold both of these truths at once. When fear of chaos rises, the arguments for realism gain weight. When the costs of past decisions become visible, the demands for accountability grow louder. Diplomacy itself sits in that uneasy space. On the surface, it looks like quiet meetings in well-lit rooms, late-night phone calls, carefully drafted communiques. Behind it, there are also covert operations, pressure campaigns, arms deals, and bargains that never get written down. Sometimes diplomacy prevents wars. Sometimes it merely rearranges where the violence falls, making it less visible to those at the center. Sometimes it does both at the same time. Henry Kissinger's career makes that double nature easier to see. The same man who helped open doors between hostile capitals also helped authorize bombers over distant provinces. The same style of calm, strategic thinking that reduced one kind of risk increased another. As you trace his story from refugee to power broker, from Oval Office to private boardrooms, you can watch how power works in our world: concentrated, self-confident, often insulated from those who feel its weight most directly. In the end, history remembers power in layers. One layer is the official record: treaties signed, wars avoided, institutions built. Another layer is carried in families and communities far from the centers of decision-making: the memories of planes overhead, of sudden disappearances, of borders redrawn without consultation. Both layers are real. Both are part of the long shadow that figures like Kissinger cast. Over time, the arguments about him may soften, but they are unlikely to disappear. He will remain, for many, a case study in what modern statecraft can achieve, and in what it can justify to itself. And as the world moves on to new crises and new strategists, that shadow stays as a reminder that the calculations made in quiet rooms travel a long way, that the language of stability can hide many kinds of pain, and that sooner or later history comes back to ask not only whether a strategy worked, but what it cost and who was asked to pay.